Go ahead.
Hey guys, this is Kevin Kane with Precision Powerlifting Systems. I'm joined by Jay Birdie of Jay Birdie Fitness. This is like take 6 on this. I'm trying to stay on topic and not rant. Keep things relatively short. So the topic I want to discuss today is frustration and agitation and how it relates to high-level performance. Because both of those are necessary in order to develop high levels of skill. And when I say frustration and agitation, I don't mean like throwing a temper tantrum in the gym. It comes with an understanding that your brain doesn't view that frustration and agitation as an emotion. It views it more as a wake-up call to what's going on in the environment. And that wake-up call is really important because our body runs this, we're always in this weird paradox of where our body and our brain, we're always trying to learn new things, but we're also trying to automatize a lot of these things so that our unconscious brain has a lot of extra energy to kind of be aware of its surroundings and take in more information. So it's this weird paradox of constantly learning, but then trying to push this stuff down into lower levels so that we don't have to expend so much energy to do the same tasks over and over. It's basically about preserving resources and allowing us to learn more so that we can have greater survival benefits as a species. So in terms of frustration and agitation, right? So I think it's best that we kind of understand how the body learns, right? So when we're younger, right, or how the brain learns. So when we're younger, so this term here, neuroplasticity, this is a good thing. This is our brain's ability to adapt and learn new behaviors, okay? And by behaviors, that includes lifting heavy weights. So I think a lot of times when we think of skill acquisition, we just think of it as the technique within the lifts themselves. That's not entirely true. That's just part of it. How much force we apply to perform a movement is pre-planned by the brain. So the part of skill acquisition is the ability of the brain to get the right motor neurons to produce force. So for example, if I'm going to reach for one of these markers, I'm going to reach with a lower velocity than I would if I'm trying to throw a baseball or project something, a javelin or something like that, right? So the velocity of that movement is going to be very different. Now, what we have is we kind of have this. So we have upper motor neurons. We have this kind of central processing piece. And then lower level. All right, so this is a very simplistic way, and this is something that I'm learning as I'm going along. And part of me doing this video is for me to say it out loud. Because sometimes when you say things out loud, it just brings different thoughts into your own brain. So it's for my own learning too. So some of this stuff I might have to update, I might have to retract and kind of change my words a little bit as I learn more and make it less simplified. But I think it's best if we start very simple and then we kind of expand upon those concepts as we kind of go through the process of it. So the upper motor neurons here pass things through central processing down to lower level motor neurons. This is an extremely important concept to understand because in order to learn anything, we need these upper level motor neurons to be initiated, okay? So what happens is when we first start learning a skill, right, we're extremely aware. So that's the sign that our upper level motor neurons are being turned on, okay? But over time, we want to automatize the process so that we don't have to expend so much energy on it. So what ends up happening is the upper motor neurons kind of say, fuck this, I don't want to deal with this anymore, I think we're good to go. And they pass it down to the lower level motor neurons to kind of take over. And this right here, this is our passive reflexive system. Okay, if we're just using the lower level motor neurons, that's our passive reflexive system. And it's very important to understand that. Okay, this is extremely important for our survival as a species. Because it does allow us to free up space to learn new things, for our unconscious brain to take in more information, but it also saves energy, okay? It costs much less energy to do something that's more habitual than it does for something that takes a lot more of our attention and focus and stuff. So, for example, when you're learning to drive a car, you get behind the wheel for the first time, right? And like, it doesn't matter if the radio's on, you're kind of nervous because your parents sitting next to you, right? You might have your learner's permit, you're driving a little slower, your hands attended to, you're kind of aware of everything that you're doing, right? Because it's a new experience to you, you're kind of taking everything in, you're paying attention to it, right? And maybe even in this case, having the radio on becomes a distraction because you can't handle so many things because your brain is required to utilize so much energy to pay attention to yourself driving. Over time, what ends up happening, so that's an example of that upper level being turned on. Over time, what happens? You drive, and now you're 31 years old, right? You're running a little late to get to your business. Now you're driving, you're listening to the latest Drake song on the radio, you're putting on your makeup, you're Snapchatting all at the same time. But you get my point. So at that point, it doesn't matter, right? So you might even be at the point now where driving, you need to have the radio on because you need your brain to kind of take in some information, or you just get really bored, right? Or you're driving somewhere you don't even remember driving there. Like that's like you get out of the car and you're like, wow, I don't even remember that ride at all. That's that passive reflexive system actually taking part in that. So being from the Northeast, we get snow a lot. So you might go 9 months from the last snowfall to the first snowfall. So that first snowfall, if it's significant enough, you'll start paying attention again. And maybe then you turn the radio down because you're trying to pay attention to how your car is handling on the roads with all the snow. That's a sign of like a variation coming in that gets the awareness of those upper motor neurons again. And that's where like learning can actually take place. So when I talk about, so when you're younger, right? So from up to the point of being 25 years old, you have a ton of neuroplasticity. Your brain is extremely adaptable, and you can learn new skills much easier than you can later on in life. But that doesn't change anything, right? Because later on in life, you can still learn these skills. You just have to be a lot more deliberate in the way in which you're trying to learn them. And there's a trade-off, right? So the older you get, the more experience you get. So let's look at this in terms of powerlifting. The older you are and the longer you've been in the sport, the more answers you have to the problems that come up. Where if you're younger and you have a lot of neuroplasticity and everything seems to be working for a period of time, right? You see junior lifters who just do well on a ton of different programs, up until the point where they're 25 years old probably is. I'm sure if we actually broke down the statistics of lifting, there's probably something to that age bracket. I know that weightlifters hit their peak around 25, 26 years old, which could be a giant coincidence, or there could be something skill related to that aspect of it. So what they lack in experience, they make up for in neuroplasticity. So in complex systems, there's always a trade-off. I keep rubbing the thing and I'm getting the marker all over my hands. So what we need to do though, in order to learn, is we need to turn on these upper motor neurons. We need to be that kid sitting in the car for the first time trying to learn to drive, right? And there's ways that we can go about doing this. So one, we have to, or it could be like being an adult, that snowstorm, right? Turning on those upper levels. So in the gym, we have to try to create a similar environment. So variation for one, especially if it's, so let's take, I'm going to use a typical, like, kind of what you see in IPF powerlifting, especially here in America in terms of like programming, where very little variation is utilized, and there's this trend to use the lower RPE sets. So let's say we're going to use a little bit of variation. We use a high bar squat, but we're going to do it at an RPE 5 or something, right? What we got to be careful of is just being stuck in this passive reflexive mode, right? So the weight is probably not significant enough to catch your attention. The variation's probably not significant enough to catch your attention. So in that case there, it's a lot of just passive reflexive going through the motions type stuff. You can't just check a box, and just working hard is not enough to achieve high levels of performance. And what I'm talking, so my goal is to take everybody that's part of this team to make them competitive at a national level. Every single human being has that capability of being competitive at that national level. Not everybody is going to win a world championship, but they can be in that top 10% of powerlifters or whatever, right? Whatever skill you're trying to choose. But I think people get so hung up on just oh, well, people hit a 5-pound PR doing this, so it has to work. That's getting them from maybe point A to point B. But if high level performance is all the way over here, how do you go from point B to that high level performance, right? Because at some point, those little 5 pounds stop happening. And you can look at it from a physiological standpoint, where you start thinking, oh, I got to build more hypertrophy. I got to get this one part of my body stronger. And some of these things do have some efficacy in terms of long-term strength development. And I'm not saying that. But at some point, it comes down to this. It comes down to how can you turn your brain on? How can you develop the neuroplasticity, get the attention of your brain to develop a high-level skill? You need to divert that energy from being passive, where you're just putting a very little amount of energy into developing a new skill, into that attention and focus, really energizing, having that brain really pay attention to that stuff. So a lot of that energy is going to develop high levels of skill. So how do we do that? So the variation has to be enough to catch their attention, right? So a high bar squat done with a low load might not be appropriate in that case, right? But where it might be appropriate is in developing developing habitual skill, right? Because you do have to repeat this stuff over and over again in order for it to actually develop and for it to just be second nature, because you don't want to think so heavily about every movement that you're doing when we're competing. So there gets to be a point earlier on where you probably want to light up the brain and get it really paying attention, but at some point you want them to pass that skill down so that you don't have to spend a ton of energy on it and work on the next thing. And then get the next thing, get them to pay attention to the next thing, and then keep cycling through that. And that's how you get continual progress over a longer period of time to finally develop that higher level of skill. So maybe we could take the high bar squat and do a max effort type of lift where you get the load heavy enough, you get them having to decide what weight to put on the bar. And when the weight gets heavy, it catches your attention no matter what, right? Because that's what gets that psychological arousal, whether it's good or bad. So you could do that, or there is a high recovery cost that comes with a high bar squat, because you're probably squatting pretty close to your best comp squat in a high bar position. And if you're maxing out, if it's truly an RPE 10, there's a lot of recovery cost associated to that. And what ends up happening, and you hear old powerlifters talk about this a lot, right? How you can't just squat, bench, and deadlift to fix your squat, bench, and deadlift, right? So if I'm trying to build up the hamstrings and lower back, and I give somebody a high bar closer stance squat, so it's all quads and glutes for the most part, if that's already their strength, I'm not developing a weakness. So it's just going to further embed, right? We're going to start passing down that, like, hey, when shit gets heavy, these are the movement strategies we're going to lean on. We're going to use our quads and drive the knees forward hard in the hole, because that's what we're comfortable doing. What you end up doing is, even though you put that right load on there, you end up developing a habitual skill that may not necessarily be what you want it to be. And in that case, it gets very hard to break the longer that you do it. And I understand, like, the individualization of technique, and everybody's going to choose different things and stuff, and I understand that concept, but you can only outlift physics for so long. So if I'm going to squat with a very close stance, the more my knees bend, the longer the range of motion. I don't want to lift in a longer lift. And then the argument's always, well, conventional versus sumo. Sumo's less, but some people pull more conventional. The majority of world records nowadays are being broken pulling sumo. Unless you're huge, most world records are literally being broken pulling sumo. So at some point, you probably need to manipulate the range of motion the best you can to actually improve your leverages in the lifts in order to develop high levels of performance. Yes, maybe you can get mediocre, intermediate, or even high levels of performance by neglecting those physical aspects, the physics of the lifts themselves. But the majority of people are going to have to use the larger muscle groups, use more muscle groups, and manipulate the range of motion to the best of their abilities for high level of success. Not just this 5-pound PR to go from point A to point B. I'm talking about being competitive at a national level. And if somebody's starting at a lower level, right, it's going to take a long time to get there. And the coach has to be patient, and the lifter has to be patient. And impatience is literally one of the worst things that you can bring to this. All right, so we need to use variations that actually put them in those positions. So if the lower back and the hamstrings are weak, I can use good mornings, but I can't just use good mornings. I have to use good mornings with maybe box squats or something like that, that actually like target those areas and bring that new, because there are bottom up and top down pieces to it, right? So if I strengthen the hamstrings and the lower back and I'm updating the brain with like, hey, these areas, they're building up, they're getting strong, they're good to go. And then you start taking that increased strength and start putting it into a different technical aspect of the lift, like sitting back on a box with a wider stance and doing stuff like that. Eventually you kind of see that emergent behavior that you're looking for. So I think a lot of people think when I say that I want a squat of a wider stance, and for a raw squatter, I want the heels just outside the shoulders, right? I want them to still have leverage. There's obviously a point where you can go too wide, but I don't just tell them to go there. It's that behavior needs to emerge, and you have to be patient and you have to really build it up. You can't just force it to happen. And how quick somebody learns is one, I do think a part of that falls on the coach and their skill level in doing that, but it also falls on the lifter to be accountable for all of their actions and stuff. All right, so we kind of got a little bit of how to get people to pay attention with variations. What's really important to understand, so frustration and agitation, where I kind of want to start bringing this down, is you cannot develop high levels of skill as an adult without frustration and agitation. And again, this doesn't mean having something bad happen in the gym and then you throw a temper tantrum and you're like, oh, this sucks, I can't do this. Because what happens in that case there is that learned behavior is becoming a learned negative behavior. When that frustration and agitation kicks in, it literally sets this environment of learning. And what happens next becomes the most important part of training. Because if what happens next is you throw a temper tantrum and you kick rocks and you fucking complain on the internet, you're literally setting up a behavior to be that person. So that every time that frustration and agitation kicks in, that's where your energy goes, to feeling sorry for yourself, to kicking rocks, to doing those things, right? But if you take that frustration and agitation and you harness it and you focus it into something positive, right? That if you look at that frustration as being something that's positive, something that you look forward to because it's going to teach you a lesson. And in that moment in time, if you can sit there and be like, okay, this is the lesson it's teaching me. This is the next step I'm gonna take because it's literally laying that groundwork, and I'm gonna explain what happens. Okay, so when we get frustrated, I'm literally gonna make you guys Scrabble fucking champions from listening to this video. So when you're frustrated or agitated, right? So we have these things called neurotransmitters. Okay, so these are like little messengers, right? But what they do is, so in between neurons we have space, and in this space there are synapses. On these synapses there are receptors. Each receptor is built to fit a neurotransmitter. So these they kind of carry the message, but what they do is when they hit that receptor with certain neurons, they create this reaction within the human body that gets certain, basically it's there for our own survival, right? So let's talk about this one first, actually. Dopamine. So when you think of motivation, dopamine is typically the neurotransmitter that's responsible for motivation. And when I talk about motivation, I'm not saying you wake up and you're like, yes, I want to go to the gym. In a lot of cases, it's more just drive and grit. When you feel like shit, you still want to go to the gym and you still want to be a part of that long-term learning experience of developing high-level skill, because you know the good days are just as bad as the bad days. So one thing I say to the group a lot is there is no good or bad, there just is, right? So if you really dive into the process and you understand that it's a lifelong journey of learning more, I think you can start to embrace these types of days, and that's where like drive and grit become extremely important. So one thing that I learned from Shaco is he called all of his lifters students. So the coach is a teacher, and he's teaching them how to develop better movement strategies, how to make better decisions, how to do all of those things. And it's a lifelong pursuit of perfection. And that's one of the things he would talk about with technique, that like perfect doesn't necessarily exist, but you should always try to pursue it over the long-term process. It's diving into that process. And this is kind of what I try to do with my group as well. So dopamine is basically our motivation signal, right? The more dopamine we have, the greater the reward we feel within our bodies for doing something. So there are things that we can do to increase our dopamine production. So one of the things that I like to do in our programs, week 1, we leave 5 to 10 pounds on a bar for a max effort lift. We focus and work on something. Week 2 and then week 3, we try to hit a PR. That little PR gives you a little dopamine blast every single time because you get that little bit of reward. Okay? So, cocaine, that works for dopamine as well. That's Jess's favorite. Okay, so when we get frustrated, this neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, right? It's our adrenaline. That kicks in. Okay, so this is what wakes the body up and the brain up to be like, hey, there's a stressor here that we need to deal with, and we need to utilize some energy to actually pay attention to and to kind of figure out and to kind of learn from. Okay, so norepinephrine kicks in, and then Jess, remember this from her class the other day. And then we get another one called acetylcholine. So what acetylcholine does is it turns on neurons, right? It gets these neurons ready to respond. So this is literally setting up an environment to really learn something, okay? So if we get frustrated and we have the right actions, right? We could be like, okay, so this happened, this is what I need to fix. That acetylcholine will turn on those neurotransmitters. We go, we do the right things underneath the weight, or we change up training a little bit. So like one of the things, one of the PPS lifters missed a deficit deadlift PR, would have been a 5-pound PR on a deficit deadlift. But we saw the breakdown and we changed what was on the sheet to do straight knee deadlifts after, to kind of build up those angles and work on certain strength at certain angles and certain positioning stuff. And we added that in. So at that moment in time, right, we got a good learning environment. We're getting the most out of that exercise right there because we were present, and these are just setting up the environment to like really learn and develop that high level of skill in that period of time. Okay, if we just sulked about it and then we half-assed something else, we left the gym, we did other things, that acetylcholine is turning on the neurons to act like a fucking baby. So that's what you're learning. That's the learned behavior. You can either learn to get better at what just went wrong, or you can learn to be a whiny piece of shit. I don't know a better way to say it. Do you? No? So then, we do that. Sleep. The actual adaptations only happen when you reach these deep state sleep cycles. All right, so if we don't sleep after doing all this, it doesn't fucking matter. Because you're not gonna, those motor neurons, you're not gonna develop the myelin, and you're not gonna have the adaptations that you're looking for. So if you're staying up late at night on Snapchat, scrolling through Instagram, not getting those levels of sleep, you're gonna struggle to have those adaptations and the improvements that you're looking for. You can get away with it up to a certain point. Maybe when you're younger, you have increased neuroplasticity and it doesn't matter quite as much, you're getting enough and you're developing, but at some point it's going to catch up to you, and those adaptations will not happen without sleep. And then repetition. All right, you got to do it over and over again. So you got to constantly make your body aware of it needing to spend energy in these places, right, to develop these high levels of skill. At the end of the day, yes, we're all different in like how people are going to learn, how fast they learn, the things that they might need to learn those lessons are going to be very different, but we're still made up of almost all the same physiology. So this stuff applies to every single person. And every single person, if they apply these pieces, can develop high levels of success or high levels of performance. But again, it's learned behavior. So if your training environment is set up in a way where it's always easy, at some point it just becomes this passive reflexive process where you're just checking a box and doing things. It will stop working. So there's this large trend in powerlifting to utilize these very low RPE training programs. They have their place in developing automatized movement strategies, but if you're not putting yourself in the shit stepping outside of your comfort zone a little bit, you're not going to develop high levels of skill. You might still get improvements because there are physiological adaptations that occur. Yes, if there's, maybe you build some hypertrophy and you are able to develop more force production and you hit a PR without necessarily putting yourself out of your comfort zone, right? You probably get this period of time, right? When we talk about beginner gains, once those run out, you need to make yourself uncomfortable in training. And this includes by load, by position, and by you actually putting your attention and your effort into the right places. So with the programs that we run, we take heavy singles a lot. We do a lot of max effort work. You're going to get frustrated. You have to get frustrated in order for your performance to develop into, from what it is now, into high level performance. Most people won't have the ability to be frustrated and do the right things afterwards. So if you get frustrated, your first thing is to get frustrated, and it's to complain and bitch and moan and divert energy from the effort and making the changes and learning the lessons that error is trying to teach you. If it's going towards something else, your learned behavior is going to be that, instead of being an athlete. Like, being an athlete is learning to put yourself outside your comfort zone and actually learn from those mistakes and make those adjustments, and then learn from the new mistakes and make those adjustments. And you have to do this continuously forever in order to have the neuroplasticity to develop high levels of skill. But I'll tell you, the majority of people, I mean, I've had lifters that'll sign up with me, and within 8 to 12 weeks, they just don't want to do it anymore because I'm telling them to do something that makes them uncomfortable, and they don't want to be uncomfortable. The majority of people don't want to do this. But I think understanding why you need to do this in order to actually develop high levels of skill, and you need to understand what your goals are, right? So like when I talk about that motivational piece, if you don't care about competing at nationals, you just want to lift weights to have some fun or whatever, that's great, you can do that. But like a program like this is probably going to break you really quick, and you're just not going to enjoy doing it. And that brings me to another point. When we talk about having fun, fun is not a necessary component of high level of skill. If you're trying to develop high level of performance, when you actually look at the research of like high level violinists or chess players, they don't mention fun. They actually say that the training and the practice for it's not fun, but that being embedded in the process itself and learning new skills, and then dealing with that adversity, and then on the other side of it being rewarded by getting applause at a performance or hitting a 5-pound PR or something like that, that's that motivational kick, right? That's where that dopamine comes back in and kind of makes you want to keep doing it. Now, in terms of like always learning and exploring and stuff like that, we are rewarded neurochemically for doing those things. That's literally, our species is here to we're here to survive, right? And to be able to push our genetic code into the next generation, to have those children survive. And when resources become scarce, right? These neurochemicals are there for these reasons, so that we're constantly trying to pursue intellectual pieces. It's more about the advancement of our gene pool than it is anything else. So there are rewards to actually like learning, making mistakes, and getting better. We're built that way for survival. So it doesn't have to be fun, but understanding the process, enjoying the process, and doing it with like-minded people brings a certain fun component to it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that like it should never be fun and all of those things, but you learn how to find fun within those. And I think fun is a byproduct of finding something that you're passionate about, that you're curious about, doing it, and just understanding that the process itself there are going to be periods of the process that aren't fun to do, that are going to be very frustrating and agitating, and that they have to be that way, and that your brain doesn't view frustration and agitation as emotions. It views them as a signal that it needs to pay attention and it needs to develop a new skill. And then it sets everything else in motion in order to develop that skill. So if you're just always seeking out fun in training, there's nothing wrong with that, but you're not going to develop high levels of performance in doing that. So it's understanding this concept that frustration and agitation need to be part of the process, but it's how you handle frustration and agitation. It's not just you pat yourself on the back, oh, I'm frustrated, so now I'm going to get better. It's what you do immediately after that frustration that sets the stage for your learned behavior after it, right? So your learned behavior can either be to be a whiny little asshole, or it can be to be an athlete and actually enjoy the long-term process of developing high levels of skill, which is very rewarding on the other end of it. You have any questions, Jess?
Mm-mm.
You fully understand that? All right. Well, you can follow me on Instagram. It's KWKN, our team, Precision Powerlifting Systems. Follow Jay Birdie at Jay Birdie.